Hello.
Welcome back. So this panel is about the future of open source in Open RAN. We already heard before that that might be an interesting topic. So we decided to have a panel discussing a bit what all of the details here are. There's one important point that sets this panel apart from all of the others. We do not have an operator on stage, which is interesting, no? I wonder why. So I want to start this panel basically with giving my two panelists, Tim and Andre, the chance to introduce themselves and maybe to say a few words about like why is open source in ORAN an interesting thing for you. Maybe Tim, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm working at SUSE. For those of you who don't know who we are one of the. It's probably fair to say we're one of the 3 pure open source companies in the market. The other 2 are maybe a little bit more famous for various reasons. Red Hat because they are the bigger company, and Canonical because everybody uses Ubuntu. If that's why you know them, I would recommend you to take a look at OpenSUSE, which is actually also a quite nice and free operating system. But the fun fact is actually that we are the oldest of the 3 companies. So we've been in the market for 1 year longer than Red Hat exists. So we were kind of the first ones having the idea that there is a need for a company that helps people use open source in a reliable way, also for enterprise use case. And that's basically what we do. We're not selling our software. The software is free, but what we are selling is sort of the necessary help that is required in order to use open source software, for example, in telecommunication networks or for any other business critical use case where it's about making sure services are reliable, secure, and all these things. Why is open source important in the context of Open RAN? I think in order to not sort of get ahead of what we are discussing later on, I'm going to make it really simple. There is no Open RAN without open source. You literally cannot run Open RAN without open source because the minimum you need is a server with an operating system on it. And I mean, I'm not sure if anyone has ever tried, but I wouldn't recommend running Open RAN on a Windows operating system. It's probably doable, but I don't think anyone is seriously considering to do that for real. So, I mean, there you have it, right? Like without open source, there is no Open RAN, basically.
Thank you. It's a pretty good take, I guess. Andre, you want to continue here?
Yes, so I'm Andre. I'm with Software Radio Systems, or short SRS. So we are the company behind SRS RAN, formerly known as SRS LTE. So we are also a true open source company. So since the inception over a decade ago, so we've been focusing on building RAN software, and then open sourcing that software in 4G. So we've done the UE actually as well, so software stack for the UE and the RAN. But with 5G, we kind of went a different approach in which we are, going more, focusing more on widespread and then focusing on the RAN here. And we did a kind of a radical step about 4 years ago where we, based on our knowledge of implementing a 5G prototype solution on our 4G stack, which was very successful, a DARPA funded project actually where we extended the UE and the eNodeB 5G NSA and SA. But the biggest learning from that is that it's actually quite complex and not ideal to use an existing 4G stack and then building 5G on top. And to get all the benefits from 5G and then from the disaggregation and from all the promised benefits, we kind of said, okay, we are going to design a new architecture from scratch, embracing all the ORAN, all the 3GP interfaces, and that's what we have today as RAN 5G, and that's totally open source under an OSI approved license, that is what we are talking about today, no?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's one very important piece of the software that you need to run your ORAN. So when we talk about all the different software pieces that you need to run ORAN, and also looking back at the summit of last year we had a session about OCloud, and the very interesting, there were a couple of very interesting takes. There's like, you need somehow this OCloud thing, right? If you want to run all of your workloads, you need something below that, so you might need that. And so what is this? What is your take, Tim, on this like open source OCloud part. I think there's like one project, at least that I saw, that comes to mind, like Silva. We discussed that very vaguely last year, but I think Tim would be a very good candidate here to give us a bit more of a background. Where's this going?
Yeah, so Project Silva, for those of you who don't know it, is basically a project that aims to develop a common blueprint for a telco cloud solution purely based on open source and in a vendor-neutral way. It was originally started by 5 European operators teaming up, Deutsche Telekom, Orange, Telecom Italia, Telefonica, and Vodafone. They invited Ericsson and Nokia to be part of the founding group, and then SUSE joined a little bit later to sort of cover off the open source aspects of the stack. The project has been quite successful in developing a running stack, a workable stack, and that's actually one key differentiator this project has versus a few of the other initiatives that have existed in parallel and previously. So there is a strong focus on making sure that the stack is actually usable, that the software always runs, it is actually being used in a couple of the participating operators in production today. And it is the intention with Silva is to build a horizontal cloud stack, which basically means it should be able to support any telco cloud use case, any telco application, from packet core. OSS, BSS is usually not that much of a challenge, but of course also for the RAN. Like RAN has been a specific focus of the last couple of releases in Silva, and we have done a couple of contributions to that end as well, contributing our experience stemming from some of the collaborations we have with our RAN and O-RAN partners. So the stack is getting quite close to being ready for RAN scenarios, both from a runtime point of view, in the sense of having, for example, a real-time kernel option available in the operating system, having configuration templates for the Kubernetes layer that are able to accommodate RAN workloads on top, but then also from a management stack point of view, we are using Cluster API and Metal Cube for bare metal automation, so that we can also zero-touch deploy and lifecycle manage the software stack in a RAN use case, because that's an important characteristic of a RAN scenario, that you don't want to have qualified staff on site having to do manual interaction with the physical hardware. So I would say, all in all, Silva can be looked at as an O-Cloud, but it's of course not only an O-Cloud. It supports other telco cloud use cases as well, but there is all the necessary ingredients are there so that it can feature as an O-Cloud if that's what's required for a given use case.
Yeah, thank you. One thing that is interesting about Silva is that it's not a project where a lot of software has been newly invented, right? So Silva is like, it's a group of people and consortium that reuse software that is already there in open source. It reuses Linux, Kubernetes, all of these things that you talked about, the bare metal orchestrator, stuff like that. But then when it actually comes to O-RAN, and that's something maybe more of a question to you, we need to put the workload on top of that, right? We would put some CU, DU, whatever else on top of that. And that's something that might not be naturally coming as an open source solution, because I have the feeling a bunch of companies have been earning quite some money with not providing this as open source for quite some time. So interesting decision from SRS to go into this direction. Do you think we'll see more in the future there, or?
More from us, definitely. So yeah, I mean, we are all in with this, and we see a clear opportunity. But I mean, historically speaking, I guess the reason why this has not been the case with Silva or other similar platforms is probably because the lower hanging fruit is in the core and other elements, and not so much in the RAN, which has its challenges with the, you know, with the DU and the timings and all those kind of things. So it's good to start slow and go with that. But yes, in general, it's a good thing. And with O-RAN, obviously, with all the specifications that are open, it's an enabler for companies or projects in general to write telco code, right? And then this has not been the case before. And then if there was if it wasn't for the open frontal interface, for example. And that's something that we always suffered in a way in 4G, that it was not possible. Even though we had the technology, we could not interface with a commercial radio unit, right? And that's something that O-RAN brought, and with the open frontal, and then which others are also doing. And then I think there's more projects coming, more companies doing that or more projects, groups gathering. But obviously, it's not ideal, the state that we're currently having. One issue that I see is the adoption of that. So yes, we are an open source project, but also the company behind the project is contributing 99% of the code. So in an ideal way, an open source project would see adoption, community adoption. It would be a combined effort, right? And that's, I think, something that we would like to move towards. And there are a few challenges to solve still, especially looking at the telco industry and then their IPs and all those kind of topics. But that would be interesting, and I see things changing there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think like you made a very important point about the adoption of open source in telco, and I think like one of the main blocking things there, usually at least what I've heard through the years, is who is responsible for all of that stuff? Because I'm now consuming open source code, so who can I sue if this goes wrong, basically? So what's your opinion there? Like, who's responsible when we build this whole open source stack, or who should be responsible in the future if we build it just on open source or with more open source in it?
So, I mean, if you look at it from the viewpoint of building a radio access network with open source components, I don't think there is an actual difference in that situation compared to a more traditional approach. Ultimately, the operator is always responsible for the outcome. And that has always been the case. If you look at regulatory obligations or security obligations, like if you just look at, for example, the Cyber Resilience Act that's coming out, which categorizes mobile radio networks as critical infrastructure, the operator is responsible for making sure that those services are available. The question is how much of that responsibility can be delegated to others, and what's the relationship between the different companies that are involved in building the system technically. Traditionally, there has been quite a lot of responsibility transfer to sort of the vendors that are in the background. In a disaggregated scenario, that balance obviously shifts a little bit. But there are, for example, still situations where the overall integration responsibility, for example, gets outsourced to a systems integrator instead of being with the company that actually sort of commercially operates the network. So like disaggregation and openness doesn't necessarily mean that the operator has a significantly different piece of the pie, so to say, from a responsibility point of view. But at the end of the day, somebody needs to make sure things work together. And one of the key benefits that disaggregation and breaking things up into open components has is that the sort of the secret knowledge that is required to make such a system run becomes more and more commoditized, like because there is a larger set of people that get exposed to that type of knowledge, and so simply the group of people that have the necessary knowledge to make it work grows over time. It's not as concentrated in small groups that work for particular companies anymore, and I think that benefits the whole industry to a very great extent. And if you look at how far O-RAN has come over the last like 5, 6, 7, 8 years, you can see that there is significantly more knowledge available in general through documentation, conference talks, and everything to make things run. So it's not as secret anymore how to make things run as it used to be.
I think this is probably a good take from a larger system integrator in the end, or Linux distributor, right? But if we look at like a bit of a smaller player in the market, like Andre, do you like think you want to have a system integrator between what you do and what you sell, or how do you see this?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, we see it in a similar way. So us being like a pure COD software vendor, we definitely lead like a system integrator which takes the responsibility of building the end-to-end system and makes sure everything, selects the components, makes sure everything works together. Ideally, obviously, we pre-test and give suggestions, but it's up to the system integrator with the end customer to kind of ensure that. But yes, the knowledge and the learning curve is very steep, and again, the disaggregation and all the interfaces and all the like possible things that are that can be changed and can go wrong. The attack surface, so to speak, is great. Is larger than in a completely co-located and single vendor system, and so this knowledge transfer needs to happen. But at the same time, you're also benefiting a lot from open source, from all the lessons learned from data. From open source, from the infrastructure that is already a commodity in data centers, right? So why not also adopt that in the RAN? And I think that that will happen, and that we are on the right track as an industry. I mean, we discussed this. Like, we can also see that from the incumbents actually adopting the same ideas aspects. So we can't be that wrong, right? So they're also going away from building appliances and everything is virtual and everything is using open source technologies and so this is a good thing. But yes, we need someone, to come back to your question, who kind of selects the components, manages and does the integration together with the customer and then to deliver a successful product.
So taking both of those aspects for me is going a bit in the direction of like asking for more system integrators, bigger system integrators, specific system integrators. And on the other end might be more of pushing a bit of the responsibility to the actual operator in the end. Is there something where the communities that run these open source projects, or the telcos, operators, whatever they want to use them, can find some middle ground to just work better with each other? So anything where you think like this is a thing that can be improved in this interaction here?
I mean, for us, we see that more and more traditional system integrators who have traditionally worked with the incumbents and basically, to be honest, they were not really system integrators. They were buying something and they were basically giving and installing it at the customer side. And so they're now perhaps becoming more system integrators because they're seeing in the tenders and the RFIs that Open RAN is being requested, and so they need to embrace it and need to build up that knowledge. It's challenging, but that is the case. At least this is like the trend that we are seeing on for that.
Yeah, and the other thing is that I think with everything the All-RAN Alliance and the All-RAN movement in general has done, there is a vastly increased understanding of how to make things work across the industry. So by virtue of more people having the necessary knowledge and the software ecosystem becoming more used to the specific requirements of RAN, of supporting RAN workloads and making the whole system work, the integration effort also goes down over time. I think we can clearly observe a trend towards all the different components being better prepared to work with each other. The example that I always point to is that the capabilities of supporting real-time applications in the Linux kernel, they were a little bit of a corner project for quite some time, a separate patch set that needed to apply on top of the mainline kernel code base, and then you had to recompile everything. You couldn't actually compile it exactly the same way. You needed to change your compiler flags a little bit and all that. That is no longer the case as of last year. The patch has been integrated into the mainline code base. So, and that is partly due to, I would say, the pressure of the All-RAN movement towards the Linux kernel to sort of to accommodate these use cases better. And you can take this as an example of something that sort of improves the overall ecosystem to a degree where the bar you have to jump over in order to make things work isn't as high anymore. It's coming down gradually, step by step.
Yeah. I think it's a very good comparison with this kernel patch. That was handed over on paper to Linus. Yeah, that was a very cool shot.
There was a little ceremony in the Open Source Summit in Vienna last year.
It took forever to get that merged. Yeah. Switching topics a bit, and that's really something. Like 2 weeks ago, I was on the Open Source Summit in Amsterdam, and one of the biggest headlines there was really digital sovereignty. So really talking about how can we use open source software to support this vision of becoming more independent, more self-sustaining, all of those things. What are your views on which role does open source software play here? Is like multi-vendor, is that our solution? Is open source the solution? Where are we going here? Maybe whoever wants to start.
I mean, there's little debate between us, I guess, as a open source companies. Of course, yeah. I mean, we need that, and we need that ability to inspect the code, to have that transparency, and you know, to obviously also have it in Europe under control. And then open source is a key. Is a key ingredient for that, and the same applies to security. Obviously, this is also an important aspect. So we need to have like that ability to kind of have robust algorithms and not, you know, have security by obscuring things and all those kind of things that play a crucial role for us anyway. And they're key to achieve that serenity. In Europe and obviously also across the Atlantic, it's the same. So they are, you know, our friends there are following the same policy there, and this is clear from our perspective.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, at the end of the day, I think it's as simple as this. Open source is the ultimate form of digital sovereignty at the end of the day, right? If the source code is open, if there is a community project that has not only the ability to maintain the code, but also build the code, and there is a diverse group of maintainers looking after the code, that is what true digital sovereignty is about, right? Digital sovereignty is not about guaranteeing if a software company from the US makes a contract to provide government IT in a European country and then storing a copy of the code, of the source code in that country, so that if something happens to the mother country, they could still sort of take fate into their own hands and continue doing things, right? Because everybody knows that it takes more than just having the source code available to sort of continue running a given piece of software on your own if you are used to only using it previously, right? It's that you need an actual project that is built along the lines of how open source communities work today in order to make that fly.
And one thing, just to add us, that just came to my mind where you're saying with the binaries. I mean, that basically what is the counter example, right? So if you're just shipping a binary to someone, not knowing what's going on there and what code has been compiled. So we've been getting, and we've been involved in creating just very recently, like very detailed software bill of materials of our builds, because customers require that. So for each and every build, you can not only look at the code, you can not only get the pipeline of how this could be built, but for all the images, all the container images, you have a detailed list of the components that went in, the compilers that were used, all the libraries. So whenever there's a security breach or a bug or whatever, you can automatically see that your binaries might be affected, and then trace that back. And that is also very important, that traceability, so to the source. And then there's no way to have that basically without open source. Obviously, you can also have an SBOM for binary, but ultimately you want to have a look at the code, right?
I think those are very, very good takes. There was one important thing for me to learn at the Open Source Summit about open source, because there was somebody on the stage in a keynote, and the question was going along the lines of, do we need more European open source with European like digital sovereignty? And the very simple answer was, there is no European open source. Open source is not European or American or whatever else. The whole idea is that the code is shared and you can look at it. And I think it's a very interesting take when talking about sovereignty and not just European. So to wrap this up, because I already see like red numbers there, I hope I'm not getting kicked off the stage. One last thing, looking at the actual future of open source in Open RAN, like in 1 or 2 sentences, what do you think is going to happen with open source in this context in the next year?
So, I mean, I hope that things are continuing along the lines of what's happening right now, right? Because right now, I think that we are at a bit of an inflection point. I think For example, through projects like Silva, we are starting to see that there is indeed a full open source based stack available. It's possible to set it up and to make it run. And my personal perception is that also the big vendors are more and more embracing these patterns, not necessarily in the sense of open sourcing their code, but to adopt the operational paradigms that come along with it, and also to realize that at least the underpinnings in terms of OCloud and everything is something that is best done as a community effort, because it's at the end of the day based on the same technologies anyway, Linux, Kubernetes, and so on.
Yeah, and on the RAN side, I mean, we've all heard those, bad news about ORAN, and then luckily, I mean, interestingly, like those ORAN deployments, I mean, they have been using RAN software that was not open source, and then my hope and my wish is that we are actually taking that as a chance and then to continue that, but with real open source CDU. And we have a very aggressive and strong timeline. So when you're asking about and commitments, when you're asking about the future, it's bright for us, and so it is for the open source community. And yes, I believe in that. And again, so we are continuing our collaboration there, and also with Project Silva, continuing that and like our goal is here to have a full end-to-end system RAN, not only RAN, but also a full end-to-end open RAN system based on open source technology that is actually deployable. And that's the key thing, so that that can really be considered, that goes through all the testing that is available, hopefully can be extended and finally be proven to be successful.
Also wonderful lines to end on. Thank you so much.